Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark Norman, Associate Professor of Practice at Taubman College and Faculty Director of the Weiser Center for Real Estate at Ross School of Business. This is Taubman's second annual event featuring U.S. mayors. As the College of Architecture and Urban Planning, we recognize the role of municipal leaders in shaping our direction and our nation on issues like climate change, housing, social equity, and transportation. The epidemiological and economic crises associated with the coronavirus pandemic have posed new challenges and opportunities for mayoral leadership. Meanwhile, leadership at the municipal level is also key in making the long-term changes to land use, zoning, building, and energy codes, as well as mobility and other matters of fundamental importance. This event today is hosted by the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, Poverty Solutions Speaker Series, and the new Weiser Center for Real Estate. We've hosted events with mayors of cities both large and small, all innovating and iterating on pressing issues with not only local but national and international implications. Whether it's universal basic income in Stockton, California with Mayor Michael Tubbs, or tackling structural inequality in Chicago with Mayor Lightfoot, mayors have been at the forefront and on the front lines of these issues. Today, we travel to Los Angeles, city of my birth, upbringing, education, and the start of my professional life, thus a city near and dear to my heart. Like Mayor Eric Garcetti, I am the fourth generation Angelino. So I wanted to pull up a picture to demonstrate the impact that both the city of Los Angeles and its mayors have had on me. This is a picture from 1976, and you see a younger, more timid me shaking hands and also shaking while meeting with Mayor Tom Bradley, the first African-American mayor of our city, and also the mayor that brought the Olympics back to the city in 1984. The Los Angeles of the 1970s and early 80s was complex. 10 years after the Watts riots, a population of 2.8 million, very diverse citizens, and at the time, in the midst of a drought that had people saving their flushes and draining their pools. Since then, the city has added more than 1 million people, heading towards 4 million, and is in the midst of another drought and has one of the country's most acute crises of housing and homelessness. It also has inclusionary zoning, pioneered an innovative small lot ordinance allowing multiple dwellings on single lots, ADU ordinances, and a $1.2 billion bond measure to address housing for the homeless. It will host the 2028 Olympics and has a pending state mandate declaring that multiple dwellings can be built in most single-family zones. Since I was a kid, LA, which had removed most of its streetcar lines, has seen more subway and light rail line construction by mile than any other U.S. city, and contrary to its reputation, has the second largest transit system, the busiest light rail system in the U.S., and moves more than 350,000 people a day. Housing, mobility, access, and opportunity are all intertwined in Los Angeles. There will be a lot of talk, and no one better to talk about it than Mayor Eric Garcetti. In addition to being a fourth-generation Angelino, he's the city's first elected Jewish mayor and its second consecutive Mexican-American mayor. He served on the LA City Council, including 4 terms as council president, before being elected mayor in 2013. He won re-election in 2017 by the widest margin in the history of Los Angeles. During his time as city councilor and mayor, he has spearheaded the formation of housing policies and funding mechanisms for their implementation. In addition to his service to the city of Los Angeles, he served as an intelligence officer in the United States Navy Reserve and as a college instructor at the University of Southern California and Occidental College. The mayor received his BA and MA from Columbia University and was also a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University and the London School of Economics. We're incredibly happy to have him in dialogue with Taubman College's Dean, Jonathan Massey, who, while born in Virginia, received his master's in architecture from UCLA and worked in the city for a variety of architecture firms and arts institutions during his time there. Dean Massey is well-versed in the issues and politics of California, also from serving as Dean of Architecture at the California College of Arts before coming to University of Michigan. Additionally, Jonathan has written extensively on issues ranging from organicism in modern architecture to mortgage finance to sumptuary regulation. Current research examines the way architecture manages our consumption of resources, ranging from energy and water to housing, and also changing notions of place. This conversation is incredibly timely given this stage in the pandemic, the end of the eviction moratoria, the rise in homelessness, and the shifting nature of work and home life. For our students and faculty who are researching housing access and equitable development locally and around the world, and our centers, including Poverty Solutions and the new Weiser Center for Real Estate, these conversations are important forums to investigate and interrogate our current systems and create better outcomes. At the Weiser Center, we hope to provide students with educational and professional development opportunities, supporting applied research, response to the needs of industry and policymakers, and serve as a catalyst for interdisciplinary collaboration at the university and beyond. Conversations like these help us move that mission forward. So without further ado, I present to you Mayor Eric Garcetti and Dean Jonathan Massey.
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome to the Taubman College and the University of Michigan, Mayor Garcetti. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Dean. Great to be with you and the entire community. And thank you, Mark, for the warm introduction. I didn't know your LA roots, so both of you can claim a little bit of LA. We're proud to claim you both.
Well, and we're glad to connect because Los Angeles is, of course, a paradigmatic city for many dimensions of modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism. And as Mark enumerated, the city is a dynamic nexus of lots of different developments facing in very strong form some of the challenges around housing access, affordability, and houselessness that are afflicting other cities as well, but also innovating and taking measures that we don't see in every part of the country. So across your two mayoral terms, you have advanced initiatives that focus on the built environment as a platform for pursuing multidimensional goals. This is one of the reasons you stood out for us at Taubman College and at Poverty Solutions. And these include Plan LA, your new Green New Deal framework. I know you participate in the C4 Cities Network of mayors addressing climate change. Mark alluded to the bid to host the Olympics in 2028. And so from what I have read, your approach to the housing crisis follows four major pathways. And I'd love to start out by just asking you to comment on those a little bit. So increasing supply is one piece, supporting development, facilitating the production of more housing, strengthening renter protections, and supporting the unhoused or the homeless. What strategies are you finding most effective, and where are you finding the biggest challenges?
Well, it's a great question, Dean, and I think that so much, if we look at housing, I've always thought of housing not as a discrete policy area, but a prism through which we can refract everything in urban planning and urban living. A housing unit is transportation, it's justice, it's hunger, it's economic development, it's air quality. It really defines almost everything that we do and the way that we live in cities. So that's why I've had such a focus, both when I was a city council member and now as mayor, on housing, both inside, the area that I'm in charge of, but also really across the country as well, trying to influence housing policy. You're right about those categories. I might kind of reframe that it's about density, it's about subsidy, it's about preservation, and it's about defense. So that you want to add density, you need more housing units. Los Angeles is unfortunately the most rent burdened renters in the United States of America. We have a higher percentage of our population are renters than owners than New York City now, which is just a shocking statistic. We're the most overcrowded units. In other words, more people, a higher percentage of people live in overcrowded units, which I always use as a reason to add more units. I tell my people here who might be against building housing that people will have their children or come here because of jobs. They're not going to stop. It's whether they cram into inhumane conditions or whether we build that out so that you actually can have a parking space on your street, when it's a perfect human instinct to say, I don't want any more housing, I can barely move and I can't find a parking spot today. But that's really a reflection of what we didn't build, not what we did build. And we have the second biggest housing shortage after San Jose in the country. So put those three things together. Really, it's about adding density, which we're doing very creatively. I would say it's probably the most effective of all of those, is using our planning tools, transit-oriented development, which is now half of all of the housing units we're building in Los Angeles, are across these 15 rapid transit lines that Mark mentioned in the introduction, that we're building the most in US history, by just doing by right and allowing people go higher and more dense if they build on their own dime affordable home units for both low-income and extremely low-income individuals, which almost never gets built. Subsidy is also important. That's an important part of the picture, but you can never subsidize enough. We passed the largest measure in U.S. history to build housing for unhoused individuals, but that will be about 11,000 units. The need is about 184,000. So the numbers are staggering when you look at that across the region. Preservation is also critical too, because if you're building new stuff and you're seeing old units that were affordable, lost to the affordability, things like rent stabilization are very important, and buying out old covenants that will time out. And then lastly, it's defending people, keeping people who don't know their rights. So often you lose the battle in affordable housing because people have a landlord who sends them essentially an illegal letter saying you have to get out because they know they can jack the rent up. So we're offering free legal representation using some of our stimulus dollars and our own budget dollars to allow people to have that defense in multiple languages and really getting that word out there that landlords have rights and responsibilities, and so do tenants.
Thank you. Thinking about the upzoning and the density measures that you talked about and that Mark pointed to as well, the ADU ordinance is one example of that. Yesterday, Governor Gavin Newsom, following his successful defense of the recall measure, signed into law 3 new state bills, SB 8, 9, and 10, which allow duplexes in single-family housing and include other transit-oriented development density measures, among a whole spectrum of things. How do you think those will play out in Los Angeles, which has a lot of high-density neighborhoods and high-rise neighborhoods, but also has a culture and an image in many places of low-rise single-family housing?
I am unabashedly enthusiastic and so glad that the governor signed this. And that's not something you'd hear out of a typical LA elected official or a mayor, because our past is littered, our history is littered politically with folks who added density and got thrown out of office in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. But when we tried a no growth, slow growth approach, I believe those statistics of the most rent burdened population, the most overcrowded most people living in overcrowded units, and the second biggest housing shortage in the country are a reflection of what we haven't built. And that's really around zoning. That yes, there is plenty of density still available with existing community plans, but letting this go by right changes everything. We have to admit we're a big city. We're actually the 3rd largest metropolitan economy in the world after Tokyo, and basically tied with New York City. And people don't think about LA that way. We're 19 million people in a continuous metropolitan area now with this huge gross municipal or metropolitan product, GMP as I call it. And we have to start acting, I think, like most cities have in history, building out an appropriate level. Having 4 units where 1 used to be is not high density. And in fact, I would argue in most parts of our city where we still have single family living, I go door to door and knock on doors. I've done it since I've been elected official with just random constituents of mine. They're always surprised that an elected official not running for office, not needing something from them, is just stopping by to ask them what they need. But I guarantee you, I will find 3 or 4 families in a single family home today. The house is split into 2. The back garage is now maybe a permitted or unpermitted dwelling unit. And folks are cramming together. So this kind of makes it, I think, not only more honest, but the hope, just as we did with our accessory dwelling units, now by having that be by right, designs that are approved, it's a quarter of all our new housing are accessory dwelling units, where it was less than 3% when I started. So when you add these things, and people aren't seeing the sky fall, they aren't seeing their neighborhood texture being destroyed. In fact, I believe that quality of life will be that much better. You can walk to main streets, you can see a nice level of density, you have more eyes on the street for safety and security. So contrary to that old kind of Armageddon way of looking at density, it's actually something that's adding to the quality of life. It's compressing us in a good way together in a city that's often been written about as a place where we're disconnected from one another.
That overcrowding that you referenced really came into focus as a public health and environmental justice issue during COVID, when the pandemic put extra pressure on people living in overcrowded households. Yeah. And do you find that public health perspective and the lessons of the pandemic are also accelerating the change in attitudes among your constituents?
Yes, but I think in a way that maybe people didn't expect, because you'll remember this, Dean Massey, during the pandemic, there were a lot of people saying, is this the end of cities? Are people going to move out of cities? Are they too dense? And so things like COVID spread quickly. Well, when you look at the data, it's actually only New York and San Francisco that people had outflows from disproportionate. Most other cities had the normal inflow outflow of whether there was a pandemic or not. In fact, they're still growing or leveling off in certain places. Other ones that had depleted populations, people are returning to. So I don't think that people are scared of being in cities and being around density. Quite the contrary, I think there's a real impulse now to try new things, to be daring about our zoning, to allow outdoor dining, to close down streets and turn them into parks for people to walk in, or to slow down the traffic on. I think this is a moment of really bold urbanism where we realized we need each other. Something that forced us to be apart from each other is teaching us to come together. But what we can't do is cram that into an old infrastructure that we don't build out. Building up vertically might keep people from not getting COVID in the future because they're not crammed together in a single home, on a single story. Being able to, build a city out where there's more places to walk and to be safely, distanced from each other, but still get exercise is better than being stuck at home for months, as we saw so many of our young people do. So I think there's real lessons to be learned. And lastly, there's a real emphasis on public health and planning that there has not been in my lifetime. And I find that very exciting, because when people connect air quality, transportation, walking, looking at things like COVID and our health access, to me, I think that builds out a much healthier city as we move forward into the middle part of the 21st century.
Another dimension of health and long-term societal and economic and global vitality is mitigating climate change and decarbonizing our built environment. We, in architecture and planning, recognize that buildings and urban development really channel a lot of the carbon outputs in our economies and in our societies. Under your leadership, LA has adopted decarbonization goals for construction that address embodied carbon in building materials, as well as the more common approach focusing on operational energy. Obviously, setting ambitious decarbonization goals and building standards pushes against, it increases cost and complexity, and can often, people find it at odds with the goal of lowering cost and expanding access to housing. How can the city, how do you approach that tension? Supporting builders and developers in meeting these new standards while also pushing the affordability agenda that you talked about?
There's no doubt that change scares people. That's a human instinct. And sometimes that change up front can seem like it costs more. But I remain deeply convinced that in 20 years of pushing green buildings forward, that this is not just good for our health bottom line, it's good for our financial bottom line. You probably didn't think you're going to be talking to the mayor of Los Angeles about waterless urinals, but I remember when first waterless urinals were proposed, and there was a lot of pushback from organized labor who was worried they'd lose their pipes jobs. There was folks who were saying in the building industries, don't make me pay for this. The smart building owners adopted it quickly. We faced drought, not just when Mark was growing up, but we're in the midst of historic drought right now here. People said I had to crack down with water police, but changing our zoning, getting people to change whether they had grass and landscaping, but inside these buildings, those building owners that adopted these first saved a ton of money. So, I find time and time again, whether it's insulation in our homes, whether it's looking at our water supply, whether it's looking at the decarbonization of our building materials, like we're doing, it's the first city to do that under the California Buy Clean Carbonization Act. And with our own Department of Water and Power, we have the largest municipal utility. So we do a lot of incentives for people who are innovative in those building techniques, because we know we do need to be that urban laboratory, figure out the ways where it might be expensive the first or second time, so we'll subsidize you. But over time, and when we get to scale, it'll be as cheap to construct. And certainly you'll be able to finance that because you'll get the savings back on the back end when your water and your power bills are much less. We've got to get natural gas, and I think some of the other carbon sources out of our buildings, really electrify our buildings, something I'm very supportive of, and hope that Los Angeles will take some bold moves forward, and we're doing with our own municipal buildings. So, we always come first. We say, look, we're not going to force you to do something privately that we're not going to do with our own LA city government buildings first. And when we do those things, we inevitably save money, set the example, and show people that what's good for us is good for you.
Thank you. One of our students, Michelle Marin, contributed a question picking up on, I think you touched on this earlier, that creating housing not only accessible to low-income housed people, but also to the homeless population is one of the priorities. What are some of the ways that you incentivize developers or otherwise open up housing for the unhoused who typically have a very hard time accessing even traditional affordable housing?
Yeah, a couple of things. And thank you, Michelle. I mean, for me, homelessness has been kind of the issue of my life. I started working on this issue at 14 years old, back when Tom Bradley was mayor here on our Skid Row. And if I could have a conversation with myself some 30-something years later, I think I'd be shocked that this is still here, not just in Los Angeles, but as a country. Before you get to, I think, the planning tools, we have to have a right to housing in this country. And I'm unabashed about this too. I think that in the same way we don't let hunger exist in the United States, so we have an entitlement no matter how many people need it to food stamps. Same way we don't believe people should go without health care, so Medicaid is an entitlement no matter how many people need it. We strangely enough with housing say, hey, it's only a set amount, it's a lottery and good luck. 1 in 4 people in the country that qualify will get housing assistance. And in my own city, it's 1 in 8. And by the way, you'll wait years. So whatever trauma you have, and homelessness is the meeting of trauma and higher rents. You're gonna have to deal with that on the street, on your friend's couch, in your car. You're gonna be re-traumatized by that experience. So first and foremost, I chaired President Biden's campaign. I was one of his 4 co-chairs. And the only thing I asked, he said, what do you want? I said, nothing, but please put in a universal entitlement to housing, maybe through our Section 8, our housing choice vouchers, something that he did put into his platform, something that will take some years to get in, but I hope he and the Congress will continue to push for that, because I think the whole conversation flows from that. The other thing is mental health care and the prevention of people losing their housing. So let's not try to, you're right, it's so difficult when somebody is unhoused to deal with the combination of trauma and inability to access housing after the fact. So let's start with what is most important. Once they're there, though, LA has put an unprecedented amount of resources forward, whether it's passing that measure that we put before voters. I mentioned HHH to build 10,000, and we'll come in with 11,000 units of housing, a permanent supportive housing. So that's for the most worst off of the unhoused who probably need a combination of services and maybe permanent housing that we'll have to have subsidized for the rest of their lives. The next kind of category of folks who need deep help but will not necessarily need to have one of those units forever. We're trying to figure out strategies on the street. So we're doing a lot of these kind of tiny home villages, 7 of them, congregate shelters. People asked me to build a dozen. We built 28, more than anywhere in the country, with really interesting, exciting architecture, services, and case management on site. And then during the pandemic, when we had to decompress those, we actually were, thanks to the federal government and our state government and our local government working together, our Project Room Key allowed us to put people into hotel rooms and motel rooms that were not being occupied because we didn't have visitors. And we've put thousands of people, over 8,000 people, into housing this year through that, and then trying to case manage them out. But I will say it's immensely difficult to find permanent housing for folks. So the last thing I would say is don't just think about housing, think about their incomes. A lot of people aren't accessing the entitlements that they have when it comes to income. And they aren't pooling those together to find a match roommates and maybe together, as everyday housed people do all the time, to find housing in tough markets like this one. So we got to build a lot of supply, have a universal, I think, entitlement to this in the country. It sounds expensive, but it's cheaper than what we pay for the kind of homelessness industrial complex. And then really try to get street strategies that help folks who are very resistant, might be dealing with substance abuse issues in particular, to at least come into a hotel room or a tiny home village, and then from there, look at permanent housing.
With the tiny home villages, and also in some of your discussion about new uses for public space in response to the pandemic and new health priorities, you've touched on some of the ways that new design approaches are part, along with new policy measures. And a lot of architects and designers have been encouraged by your creation of the new position of Chief Design Officer and your appointment of former LA Times architecture critic Christopher Hawthorne to that role. We took note, for instance, of the recent low-rise competition, which invited designers to speculate about new housing types and configurations that could advance some of these changes in LA's built fabric that we've been talking about. tell us a little bit about your vision for the CDO position, and how do you believe that those of us who are designers or design innovators can best contribute to changing policy, changing practice, changing your city?
Well, growing up in Los Angeles, it's tough not to love great design and to love this idea of kind of the last frontier that John Kennedy, during his New Frontier speech, spoke of when he accepted the Democratic nomination here in LA at our Coliseum to be president. He spoke of LA as kind of the last frontier, and I think it's a fitting metaphor. It's where people have come to reinvent themselves. It's a place where people have come to think up new ways of looking at the world. And when it comes to design, it has attracted that always from around the world and continues to. And so I think it's important for civic leaders, whether it's redesigning our streetlights and having a competition, whether it's our accessory dwelling units, where we have now, as I said, these different architects that have submitted pre-approved plans that will help people reduce those costs and the time it takes to build something in their backyard, whether it's the work on low-rise design that you mentioned, or what Christopher has convened on civic memory. At a time, people were pulling down memorials everywhere. About a year and a half before that, we convened academics to look at Los Angeles in memory and how do we mark memory? And is that something that's just the responsibility of city halls, or how do we empower neighborhoods to make their own civic memories? And coming out of COVID, I think this is a national conversation of how we will need to do that to mark the loss and the trauma that we've all experienced. But Christopher, I was so excited to hire, and hopefully it'll be a tradition in this city and other cities. I saw in places like Auckland, chief design officers and others that were really getting folks to, LA is a very libertarian city. They think of us as liberal, but we've mostly really been a libertarian city. Like, let everybody build whatever style they want, wherever they want, even if it's right next to each other. So you'll drive through neighborhoods with mid-century modern and Tudor revival and, you know, Cape Cod and whatever, all right next to each other. It's part of our kind of marvelous chaos. But over time, we haven't had unified metro stations. We haven't had those civic cues in our streetlights. We haven't done things that kind of do tell someone you're here in Los Angeles. And thinking through when the Olympics and Paralympics will come back to Los Angeles. And I loved, Mark, your introduction talking about Mayor Bradley, who I met as a kid too. I saw a campaign ad of his for his reelection a few years ago, and it's like, we're, you know, the #1 port on the West Coast, and we're bringing the Olympics back and reviving downtown and building a subway. And I thought, nothing we do is new. We just do it for the next generation, because I'm bringing back the Olympics. Our port is #1. We're redoing our airport again and building out the subways and light rail. So I think there's lessons in that, these moments that we have where the world comes to us, where the world's looking at us, and that's always in Los Angeles, but in particular will be in 2028. Let's prepare for that. It's like, you know, meeting your future fiance's parents for the first time. You're going to clean up your apartment. You're going to make it look good. The world's coming here. Let's make sure in 2028 they see the cutting edge technology, the cutting edge planning, but also the cutting edge design that empowers and comes from communities.
Thank you. One of the premises behind this Mayor's Forum series that we do is that we really understand the centrality of mayors to shaping key factors of our built environment, but we also understand that there's a limit to what we can do on any of these big issues at the mayoral level. You talked a little bit, for instance, about your lobbying President Biden about national supports for housing. And so when we think about issues like financialization and the speculative investment in a city like Los Angeles that probably has a big impact on housing pricing and affordability, when we think about issues like that, what's beyond the capacity of a city to control, and how do we work at the state and federal levels to expand access to housing, building on some of the stuff that you and other mayors are doing at the city level?
Well, I think I made the first point already, which is that we can't subsidize enough people out of homelessness or housing insecurity. That we don't have the scale of that sort of a budget in local governments. It will have to come some degree from states, but really from our federal government. I think this is a moment to do that. I'm excited about the infrastructure and the Build Back Better bills. Those are huge down payments. But, I had this conversation with Bernie Sanders when he was running for president. I told him we should have universal Section 8 vouchers. And he said, well, Eric, that would be very expensive. And I said, but you're Bernie Sanders. Like, this is cheaper than half the things you put forward, et cetera. And when you look at the savings, it would be well worth it. And he actually, to his credit, put it in his agenda too. So I managed to get it in the two kind of leading candidates platforms. So I think that is 1, 2, 3, and 4. But after that, I think that federal government can incentivize, making entitlements and land use easier, the environmental checks less onerous, while still being strict enough to make sure we're protecting the environment. What we call environment is so often used just to tie things up in court for long periods of time. We can't control where private investment heads, and you have to be open to that and welcoming of it. But there's a tension between that and more regulation of local housing. And, I don't think that it necessarily has to be at loggerheads. Think about two of the most capitalist places in the world, Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong, the densest city in the world. We see there the public and private sectors working together. So the private sector builds these things, but it's really, public housing isn't just for low-income individuals. It's for anybody in the middle class in those cities. And in fact, there's home ownership available of that in places like Singapore. We need to, in America, certainly in our densest cities, be more aggressive at looking at those sorts of models where we invite in the private sector to do maybe the building and to have some share of it, but it's really public housing in a new model. France, across the board, 20% of housing needs to be affordable housing. So we've passed, a linkage fee here, which is kind of an inclusionary payoff, if you will, but allows us to build a lot of subsidized housing 50 years after talking about it. But those things shouldn't be off the table, and we shouldn't just assume that if you regulate rents or if you look at housing policy or mandate certain things, it'll chase private investment away. We should really sit down with bold private builders and public policymakers and see what we can do. I'll tell you, and this question, this answer, in Los Angeles, I set a very bold goal to build 100,000 units of new housing, 10,000 of them low income while I was mayor. We blasted past that, and that was more than double the pace we had before I was mayor. But for this next 9 years, we've just adopted something that says in the region we need 480 plus thousand units of housing, almost 5 times that amount that was doubled what was before. So when you really look at the scope, if we're serious about this, it's going to be disruptive to the look of cities, but it's going to be these bold new cities that can be built if we meet the actual need and think about people first, not just about protecting neighborhoods. And I always tell people in community meetings who are saying, we don't need to build anymore, the traffic's bad, et cetera, et cetera. I ask them, are your children, those of you who have adult children, are they staying in Los Angeles? And can they afford to? When you personalize it that way, people seem to realize, oh, I'd rather have my kids here than my set idea of what the street has to look like.
We have a bunch of questions populating the chat, and one of them is from Simone Al-Hagri, who notes that homelessness and food insecurity, key issues like this, disproportionately impact communities of color. And I think Peggy, building on her question, we could ask, how does your administration address the racial disparities that manifest in housing access, food security?
Simone's exactly right. It's one of the reasons we commissioned one of the nation's first and maybe only study of Black homelessness here in Los Angeles, where we saw it disproportionate. The largest rise in homelessness is in the Latino community now. And we tried to make sure that not only we are consciously counting, consciously pointing out, the data, but consciously then putting policy around that, so that we have project, for instance, to house Black women in Skid Row. And, by fair housing, you can't only target them, but if you're in the right places and target, you will have a disproportionate impact on the disproportionality of homelessness affecting Black Angelenos as opposed to non-Black Angelenos. Public policy that doesn't bring in an equity lens and doesn't call out race, doesn't call out the needs of women or veterans. There's particular communities that you can't just say, hey, this is about individuals. I agree with that very much, Simone. You have to be able to put those glasses on to see it. But more importantly, you have to put that perspective in your pen when you're writing the legislation and the policies to make sure that it has a consciousness around that too. I'm very proud of our racial equity work that we're doing. I signed a directive on racial equity, so every department has to own this, not just the usual ones like a housing department, but also our fire department, our police department, our airports, our port, our Department of Water and Power, et cetera. And then we're going bold by putting about $15 million of funds aside for communities to determine solutions to this, based in communities of color, so that these things come from the ground up. It's called LA Repair. The largest kind of community budgeting project in our city's history, and a reparations committee too, is here in Los Angeles, while the statistic nationwide on household wealth is about, for Black families, about 1/10 of white families. Here in Los Angeles, a Mexican heritage family and a Black family has 1/100th the wealth of a white family. So we have to call those things out to be able to act upon them and to really have bold things. Last, we're doing the largest guaranteed basic income program in the country as well, which will be a pilot of about, probably by the end, about 10,000 people participating in this over the next year.
Thank you. Andrew Darvin is pushing back a little bit on the subject of the unhoused, asking how to reconcile what you've said about support for the unhoused with the recent removal of folks from Echo Park.
So Echo Park, which is a beautiful lake and park, it was actually my home for 10 years in the middle of our city, was in many ways the housing of folks that were unhoused there a runaway success. I know some of the coverage was covered as if it was police moved people out. All but 2 people at the very end who had come recently, and one was charging rent to people in the tents, all willingly moved into hotels and to housing over a period of weeks and even months. And to me, there are people that were killed there. There were women that were being raped. There were people that were charging rent of folks there. There was a ton of drug dealing that gangs locally were doing and keeping people there who were addicted and not getting them help. And I wasn't going to let any more people die. The conflict that came at the end is, I think, some folks that were protesting, thinking police were being used to move those folks out, and police kind of faced off. And I think that we've learned lessons about how to do that better. Recently in Venice, we moved over 230 people, made national news that Venice Boardwalk was encamped. Again, we did that with the support of all of our city departments, but like in Echo Park, without police arresting anybody. And even the 2 people in Echo Park were literally released a block away. So it wasn't that they were arrested and criminalized. It was that it had to be shut down to clean that up. We had 23 tons, I think, of trash, needles, human excrement, et cetera, that was there. And that's not the fault of any one person. It's the reflection of our collective failure. But I'm really proud these folks are in there. The Venice folks, 90% of them are on a path to permanent housing, and similar statistics coming out of Echo Park. So I'm proud that we are able to house people, and I don't think that should divide us ever. We don't have to choose between housing people and making sure that public spaces, because remember, in this very working class neighborhood during a pandemic, this was the only place for people to recreate. And so many children, families, and communities of color were saying, I cannot go to that park anymore. And so this was, I think, a win-win that allowed those working class communities of color to get back a recreational area, and for folks who are suffering and being traumatized to be in housing.
Thank you. Focusing on the Olympics, we know that the investments cities make in Olympic infrastructure can leave a lasting positive legacy. They can also be, costly white elephants. And so Kayla Guillory in the chat has asked how you plan to hold yourself accountable or set, I suppose we could also say, set accountability frameworks for the future for the sustainability of that Olympic infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, Kayla, it's a great question. I think most cities probably shouldn't bid for the Olympics because they have to build too much. And the old model the Olympics have asked, and I've been very aggressive inside the Olympic movement pushing back, is build a whole bunch of stuff for us for these 2.5 weeks and hope that it works for you afterwards. In other words, plan for the Olympics, don't plan for the people. Well, Los Angeles is planning for the people. Whether we won the Olympics or not, we passed the largest infrastructure initiative in U.S. history ×2 to build these 15 rail lines and rapid transit lines to meet the needs of working class people who don't have access to jobs, can't get to the beach, can't get to recreational areas, et cetera. The Olympics benefit from that, but we're not building it for the Olympics. We passed that before we even won the Olympics. The housing initiative to do 11,000 housing units wasn't because the Olympics said do something about homelessness. It's because we care about homelessness and make sure. We could do the Olympics tomorrow. We have so much built infrastructure. And LA is one of those unique cities, and maybe the Olympics should come back here frequently because we already have our basketball, our velodrome, our tennis, everything. There's a couple temporary things that will be built, but there will be a legacy of a net gain from this, as there was in 32 and 84, that will be poured back into access for communities that don't have access to recreation, to sports. LA 84 revived the Olympics, made it profitable, took all that money and put it into a nonprofit that builds ball fields, that helps subsidize scholarships and coaches in communities where people can't do club play and all those other things because their parents don't have the money. when we negotiated 2028 and let Paris go first in 2024, that came with $160 million up front. So we've already made money on this, and we've put it into expanding swimming lessons so that it's particular for Latino and African-American kids who disproportionately don't know how to swim and often die from that. We've been able to make that, to equalize that into Girls Play LA, which is allowing girls now to play in more than half of our participants in our park programs when it was 25%. And I think that list goes on and on and on. So the other thing, lastly, is I hope we will be completely indemnified. I think the city will be out of any obligation for the Olympics. So it won't even be on us. That profit, though, that will come to the organizing committee will be poured into a nonprofit. It'll be of a public benefit. I would not bid on the Olympics if I were a city that had to add any money out of our general fund for it, and we won't be.
Thank you. I know we only have you for a couple more minutes, so I thought as a final from our end, we might ask about your nomination by President Biden to be the United States' next ambassador to India. Taubman College and the University of Michigan have a large active network of Indian alumni and Indian students, so many of us will be excited to see what you do in that role once you're confirmed. Could you talk a little bit about your starting vision or goals for that role, and in particular, if there are any architecture and urban dimensions to that agenda?
Well, it's an awesome question. I've been well trained by the White House and others to say, if confirmed, and those are the sorts of questions I look forward to answering in the Senate, meeting with senators right now. I'll speak a little bit about my own past history, though, with India, because I went there as a college sophomore and was going to spend my entire junior year abroad there. I studied Hindi and Urdu in college and Indian civilization history, and done a lot of nonprofit work, development work, and now with my counterparts, chief ministers of some of the regions and the equivalent of mayors on climate in particular, health access. I think the big issues that face us are around climate, urbanization. India will be the most populous country in the world in about 5 years. We're the world's oldest democracy. They're the world's biggest democracy. And we both have challenges that come with that I think we both need to address and can learn from one another. But we have this incredible, I think, exchange over the years. The people of India and the people of America have never been closer. There's a record number of Indian students coming, even in the midst of this pandemic, to the United States this year to study in great institutions like the University of Michigan. Obviously, the contributions of Indian Americans in the diaspora who are running important companies, who are leading important movements, who are elected officials and others. I really, if I have the honor of being able to represent this country, want to strengthen that for the long haul. And I think there's so much we have to learn from one another. From India to us, how we can diversify our supply chains and things like that. On the culture front, so much that we can do between Bollywood and Hollywood, between sports and things like that. It'd be great to see cricket in the Olympics in 2028 when we come here and set 1.3 billion Indian fans on fire, get them excited about it. So I think there's going to be a lot of work for our countries to do together, but I'll kind of answer that in specific ways for me when it's a Senate hearing in the coming weeks. I'll say this, I will miss every moment of being gone from Los Angeles. I am a lifelong resident here, except for my schooling. As was mentioned, a fourth generation Angelino. And when people sometimes say, I know it was in the question, what about, you won't even be around here. I won't be around as mayor anymore, but I'll be worse. I'll be a resident, a taxpayer, and a constituent. And I care about and love this city so deeply that as a private citizen in the future, walking through the streets and doing the work that I've done to as a private citizen to help people get into housing, or to cheer on and volunteer at the Olympics, to be able to look at the things that we can do to clean up and lead with a Green New Deal that's the strongest in the country. Those things will be amazing. And very last point I'll say, as chair of C40, which is the group you mentioned in the intro, this is the 100 largest cities in the world. If people don't think cities are powerful, and yes, you're right, your question asked, what are you limited in? C40 cities, that's now about 97 cities. Think of every big city in the world, basically. Over 60 of us have hit our goals under Paris or exceeding them early, whereas there's only 2 countries in the world that have done that, of the 200 plus countries. So when you're feeling down and out, are we going to address climate change? Can we address racial justice and economic opportunity? Look to your cities. We're complicated places. There's always something to complain about. But if we bring not just our yelling, but our work to it, I believe cities will lead us in the way we plan the future and the way that we bring it about.
Well, on behalf of everyone at University of Michigan, let me thank you for all of the leadership you have provided and will in future roles. Thank you to the audience for your comments and questions. And above all, thank you, Mayor Garcetti, for joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure. I look forward to seeing you in the future and calling me if confirmed, and maybe we can talk about India next time.
I love it. Thanks,
everybody.